Hello, everybody. Welcome to a special Porchlight Book Company, Boswell Book Company virtual event. I'm Daniel Golden from Boswell. We would like to welcome Sally Haldorson, Managing Partner of Porchlight Book Company. Hi, Sally.
Hi, Daniel. Hello, everyone. So excited to be here tonight. Thank you, Daniel. Welcome to everybody. I'm Sally Haldorson, Managing Director at Porchlight Book Company here in Milwaukee. How do I introduce this conversation and our guest tonight? I have a small assortment of favorite writers whose nonfiction I always read. Among them are Leslie Jamison, Maggie Nelson, Taffy Broadus or Ackner. And after reading Death by Landscape, I will also be on the hunt for anything written by today's guest, Elvia Wilk, whose intricate work in this book of essays, Death by Landscape, makes meaning, to use one of her phrases to describe her work as a writer, for us during these dislocating times, when finding meaning can sometimes feel like a fool's errand. Wilk's work will both affirm that feeling and defy it, suggesting that now is exactly the time for us to rethink what it means to be human and what it means to be human in relationship to all other things. Elvia, what an opportunity for all of us to have you here.
Thank you so much, Sally. I'm overjoyed to get this chance to talk to you.
This is the experience of reading this book, this collection of essays, is one of the best reading experiences that I've had this year, if not during the scope of the pandemic. I think it speaks very well to so much of what we have been experiencing. So we are going to dive in. It's been a bit of a puzzle for me to divine where to begin. It is such a fulsome collection. So I've decided to pull a thread, one of the many that courses through the collection, a bit like veins in a slab of marble. And that thread for me was boundaries. And I use that word fairly loosely in the sense that we can define it however needs to be defined, and to see where that takes us over the course of the hour. But before we get started with that, I'm wondering if you would read a little bit for us.
Yes, I would gladly do a short reading. I'm having an authentic Brooklyn street situation outside, which means some extreme honking might happen. In which case, I'll just pause.
It's just atmosphere.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. It's ambiance. I'm going to read from the second essay in the collection because I do think it will take us into a discussion of boundaries. It's called This Compost, The Erotics of Rot. At some point in the early 2000s, variations of a pop science news story about birds began to circulate online. Study says pollution makes birds gay, or gay by mercury, read the headlines. Scientists had observed that high levels of mercury in wetland habitats had been altering the pairing behavior and reproductive success of a species of white ibis. This was just one of many recent examples of how pollutants leaking into the environment have been changing animals' hormone systems, traits, and behaviors. Here, the story was disproportionately sensationalized due to its tinge of salaciousness. In this case, it appears that some white ibises now prefer same-sex relations over straight ones. One frequently circulated image shows a pair of male ibises strolling together along a shoreline, looking very gay indeed. The tone of such stories is one of alarm, and it is surely alarming that human-made pollutants are altering the endocrine systems of other species. White ibises who don't breed with one another are more likely to go extinct, further reducing the planet's rapidly diminishing biodiversity. The gay birds represent yet another example, part of a long list, of human behavior damaging the planetary ecosystem in unexpected ways. Yet the consistent focus on the bird's sexually atypical behavior indicates another kind of alarmism too. Queerness here is presented as a direct result of a toxic environment, a freakish aberration from the bird's natural straight orientation and egg-laying lives. Aligned with the toxic and the unnatural, the birds are anthropomorphized and their sexualities moralized according to human biases, their gayness taken as proof that the environment is poisonous. In an essay about the ibises, the health scientist Anne Pollock points out that seeing gay birds as emblematic of, quote, harm to our environment is a move steeped in heteronormativity. According to Pollock, commentators may couch their concern in terms of environmental awareness, but the seemingly deviant sex lives of animals, and by proxy ours, is the underlying scare. Pollock argues further that if we're to anthropomorphize animals to the extent that we could even call them gay, we also have to consider the possibility that their new sexual identities, assuming probably wrongly that their gayness is entirely novel rather than previously unobserved, are pleasant for them. Perhaps the gay birds are enjoying their new carefree, childless lifestyles. Perhaps some of these birds, like some humans, find aspects of reproduction a burden and have no desire to bear young. Quote, for biologists, reproductive success is often understood to be the final cause of animal existence, writes Pollock. Yet from whose perspective is reproductive success the ultimate definition of success? God's, Darwin's, ecologists, the animals? We can't know what satisfaction feels like to a bird. More to the point, human desires differ within the species. Can't theirs? While sympathizing with preservationist concerns and lamenting the possibility of ibis extinction, Pollock inquires why some behaviors and some environments are deemed natural or unnatural, why human-caused climate change gets so much attention in circumstances like these, and why bird sexuality is any of our business. It's true that the birds haven't had a choice in the matter when it comes to their environmental pollution or hormonal regulation, but then again, who does? Most people on the planet absorb a number of extremely toxic pollutants without prior consent too. Ideas about what is clean versus toxic, as in what is healthy versus unhealthy, and by extension good versus bad, are constantly in flux. One day a newspaper touts the health benefits of chocolate and red wine in moderation. The next day it advises abstinence. While many people are suspicious of funny looking apples, others purposefully buy ugly produce because imperfection seems like it must be organic. The line between sanctioned and unsanctioned shifts so often as to seem almost arbitrary. What is continually reinforced is the fact of the line itself. Yet with our leaky bodies and already mutated ecologies, we can hardly pretend that there is a state of unmodified, unpolluted, sober nature in which animals like us could or should exist and bear fruit. I'll stop there so we have enough time to talk.
That's a wonderful introduction. And I think hearing it again, even after, and hearing you read it after reading it on the page, I feel that section highlighted a lot of what we are talking about boundaries. And when I said earlier about boundaries being used sort of loosely, I would say that we can use alternatives to boundaries as categorization, assumptions, historical knowledge, all of that kind of thing. But boundaries between people, when and how they're crossed, boundaries between humans and the natural world, boundaries we've established through the categorization of things and others, boundaries that have been set for others over time, boundaries we have for better or worse set for ourselves. These boundaries come in the form of membranes, timelines, of consent, as you mentioned, of later in the book, black holes, fiction or otherwise. While you may not be calling for the elimination of all boundaries altogether, you do write, quote, faced with the possible annihilation of the planet as we know it, certain modes of knowing fall short. Especially insufficient is knowledge that purports humans to be distinct from ecosystems, much less in control of them. And that's that blurring of that boundary between humans and others. Would it be correct to say that you are suggesting that how we address climate change could be quite significantly altered if we forewent our attachment to the boundaries we've historically set up between humans and the natural world?
Yes, I think I am saying that. I think sorry, that's a short answer to your question. But it's not just about human versus nature, right? Because nature is already so affected by human. I think it's more about recognizing the fact that these boundaries are already so fucked up and that humans, in fact, are also composed of trillions of other organisms. We are also full of bacteria and viruses and funguses and stuff. And as this birds essay gets to the natural environment that the birds live in is so affected by human activity that it's really hard to draw a line and say something is natural at all. So I think it's what I'm advocating for, if anything. I don't know if this book is an advocating book, but what I'm suggesting is that we might recognize that these categories are so soluble, that we're so mixed up already, that to try and reinforce those boundaries is definitely antithetical towards learning to live in an ecosystemic way, meaning a sustainable way. But I think it's important often when saying this that, that I sort of give credence to preservationist aims. So just like I'm not saying it's a positive thing for white ibises to go extinct because of human behavior, I'm certainly not saying there's no role for preserving nature as distinctly as possible by creating reserves, for instance. But we have to understand that as kind of like a pole on a theoretical spectrum of natural and artificial, rather than a kind of absolute unpolluted space.
I think that is one of the things that's so welcome about this book, is that you engage with nuance in a way that feels a bit atypical to our sort of discussion culture these days, and where people feel very polarized in their opinions. As you said, you're not necessarily advocating for one result or another, whether it is, you know, preventing extinction or it is advocating for inclusivity with within the natural world. It really feels like you're engaging instead in a questioning. And I think that's where I feel like the book for readers is going to change and does advocate for a certain perspective. And that perspective being one that is complicated, one that is challenging. And I think one of the things that struck me about the book is that it is both empowering, but it is also challenging. It isn't about like sort of puffing up the point of view of any particular aim, but more so about discussing intelligently and on a multi-level how complicated all of this is. And one refreshing aspect of the collection for me, because the last couple of years have been very complicated, is that it directly addresses the COVID pandemic. And even in my conversations with other authors this year, we've often looked at the pandemic sort of side-eyed. And this is one of the first opportunities that I've had to feel like I got a sense of what it was to like to live and to write and to think, literally think, during the pandemic. And I think that we experienced a lot of boundary building during the pandemic, where we were either forced to be inside, we were forced to construct boundaries between us and other people. But in the essay, What's Happening, you discuss just how genre writers in the main have been anticipating such an event as the pandemic. I'd like to read a couple lines here that I hope to represent the scope of the essay. You write, quote, "Disasters do shape history and intervene in the narratives many cling to, but in truth, they only catalyze and make visible malignant processes that have been ongoing for a long time. The biggest disasters are the ones that are never identified as such, like gradual environmental devastation, which are not deemed newsworthy because they are not sensational single events." You go on to say, quote, "But this is one thing literature, post-apocalyptic or otherwise, can do, to portray how the short and the long, the small and the big connect." So I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about the capabilities of fiction to not just forecast the future, but to influence it, and whether literature and any art should offer itself toward practical aims and solutions. I know that you use the a lot of references to active change throughout the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question because it's kind of at the crux of the investigation. And I talk about it explicitly in a few essays, this idea that the question, what responsibility does fiction have to reality? Not sort of what fidelity should it have to reality in terms of accurately representing it, but should it actually take an interventionist role? Or is it delusional to think that fiction even can, and I'm certainly not, I'm not trumping up the ability of literature to do more than it can do. But I do have some cases to make for what it can do, as you said, to make scalar connections that are otherwise very hard for the individual mind to grasp. And also something else I talk about a lot in the book is that fiction can complicate the relationship between figure and ground, or individual and collective, or human and landscape, by showing how humans are part of ecosystems and maybe changing the framework that so much narrative, since modernism depends on, of an individual hero or anti-hero or actor leading us through time, through progress-based history, towards an ostensibly better future, which I argue no longer holds up now that there's a real possibility that future is gone. Or that, the future as it has been imagined for so long, especially a technological progress-oriented future, it's really hard to cling to that illusion. And so what can fiction do? Fiction can find ways to resituate the relationship between the actor and the universe that the actor inhabits, to complicate, as you say, the boundaries that we imagine between people and the rest of the world. And I also think there's an essay where I talk pretty explicitly about genre fiction and futurism, and I talk about the problem with kind of top-down solutionism, like that, any kind of ginormous solution that purports to be able to fix everything, whether it be a technology or an ideology, is essentially going to replicate the systems of power that have brought us to this state in the first place. So I advocate for a lot of small scale, you could say local, literally or figuratively, you could say like small collectives, different kinds of storytelling that change things in often invisible ways, or ways that are not, not visible to those in power. And I think that perhaps change that isn't visible to those in power is the enduring kind.
The gift of this book is that I could take this in a number of directions. We could talk about your essay on virtual reality. We could talk about your essay on LARPing. We could talk about your essay on your own experiences of exploding your book. And we will get hopefully to all of those things. But I would like to push a little bit more on this boundaries and categorizations topic before we leave it. We establish boundaries between ourselves and others through categorization, and one common distinction is made between what is weird and what is normal. Societally, I think we use weird as an alternative label for other, or as a tool for othering. Either way, we assume a sort of hegemonic understanding of what is weird, assume that there are some unspoken agreements to that classification. You clarify that what feels weird or eerie depends on who you are and is therefore subject to change. And change it does. Most people would say that these past handful of years have been exceptionally weird, whether we're talking about climate change, identity politics, or the pandemic. So instead of just, quoting you again, redrawing boundaries of normality to be more inclusive, how do we challenge the very constructs of those categorizations, weird or other, so that we can create actual functional change?
Yeah, the term weird was what spurred this book from the beginning. It's a term that I became interested in because of the way the writer Mark Fisher uses it in his slim and brilliant book, The Weird and the Eerie. The weird for him is a set of, it's a loose category for experiences or encounters that do not belong to the systems and hierarchies that we use to structure the world. So from an encounter with an alien seeming creature to a mystical encounter with a divine presence, these are things that might not be able to be rationalized, but also do not completely, necessarily challenge the laws of gravity or something. So they're not entirely science fictional. They're at the edges of explainable experience. The eerie, on the other hand, is kind of a complement to this term, and it means, I hope this is useful that I'm doing this. The eerie is kind of a more like confusing agential space. So when it's not clear what's causing something and what's being affected exactly. So the classic eerie cry from the forest. Did the cry happen because of something? Did the cry instigate something? Who was it? Was it a human? Was it an animal? Was it a spirit? So this kind of uneasy causality is kind of built into the eerie. And so these two ideas to me together allowed me to start thinking about forms of literature that are operating on sort of at the boundaries, to use your word, or right at the edge of what might be called realism, because I'm also very interested in the way that texts get categorized as different sorts of genres. So I think we could talk about genre as a kind of important boundary as well. And I guess I completely agree with you that that the weird is used as a shorthand for a kind of othering. And it's kind of so normalized, and the term is used so much that it is often kind of like a toothless in that way, but it certainly comes from a kind of othering impulse. And so in the first essay of the book, where I'm kind of going over these terms, and then throughout the book where I'm talking about what could definitely be called weird literature, I'm kind of advocating for, again, I'm using the word advocating and then kind of shying away from it, but I'll say advocating. Yeah, advocating for a shifting of the normal or the standard, or I would say the default position, because when talking about literature, the default position tends to be a white man narrator in the Western modernist tradition. So it's very powerful already to shift the frame of reference and think of a different default or a different standard in order to shift the kind of othering that is often happening, ultimately to suggest that all of these categories are always already weird, rather than to simply, as I think you quoted me saying, I'm not proposing that we just expand every category to include everything, right? And I also talk about that later in the book, where it's like, well, we're not just going to say that all animals are people. That's just trying to extend human rights to clearly non-human creatures, and maybe they deserve their own sets of rights. And same with machines or computers or AI.
I think that is one of the, I don't have my notes on this, so I'm going to hope that I can bring this up in my memory, as you talk about, I guess, dissecting text for meaning. And it's the reference to the hazelnut in the hand. And I can't remember exactly. I think you were quoting or using another person's reference there with the hazelnut, maybe. But so I feel a little bit, even in suggesting, as you just said, that you're shying away occasionally with advocating or making a case for, while I'm shying away a little bit of like, you are asserting X, or this is the meaning I'm getting from this book, because there is a certain flattening or perhaps superficiality that comes from me applying my lens on what you're intending, and vice versa, right? And I think that one of the really effective overall impressions from the book is okay, this is going to be broad, but who owns art, and what do we do with it once it's made? And so we have the author or the artist who creates a piece of fiction or a piece of art, and then that piece of art gets interpreted and or wielded, depending on whether someone puts it to use, or it gets adapted, stolen from. There's a lot of different ways that you bring in ownership over art throughout the book. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see how both there are boundaries between the experience of the artist creating the art and the person who is interpreting the art, but also that it is sort of available to everyone and their experience with the art.
It's interesting because I, for many years, have worked as an art critic. That's my original career. So I think a lot about this, but it's interesting to shift the terms to think about literature, because visual art or object-based art function very differently. They actually exist in a totally different economic ecosystem. So it's actually quite a useful comparison study. But I think what I'm focusing on in this book, I actually talk about visual art very little in this book, because I'm really focusing on storytelling and literature, also movies as a form of narrative. They come up quite a bit. But I suppose one way that I'm thinking about this is that we can assume that any narrative that enters the commodity sphere can be co-opted for profit. So one example that I bring up is a friend of mine who's a designer, but makes speculative design projects, which are meant to critique the system as it is, rather than create products that can then be sold within that system. So she created a product called e-Chromi along with a group of students, which was a speculative proposal for a kind of gut biome detector that could identify the different bacteria in your gut by coloring your poop different colors. So when you poop, you would see, my poop is purple, it must be, an overgrowth of lactobacillus. So this was like 10 years ago. They showed it at kind of like a speculative design fair. And then sometime later, she found out that a company in China had started a prototyping this exact product because they saw an opportunity for profit. And I find this to be an extremely useful example. I think about it all the time, because here you have an artist, somebody who's working in the speculative critical realm. They come up with something that they think, this was intended to show, the potential harmful uses of basically biotech surveillance, like what, somebody's gathering information about your gut biome now. But of course, the cycles of capital move very quickly. They absorb ideas, they churn them into profit. So when thinking about literature, I often think about this. I wrote a novel. I have little proof, but very much anecdotal information that a lot of the technologies I imagined critically in my book are existent. They probably existed before I came up with them individually. Maybe they were invented at the same time. Maybe somebody picked up on them. It doesn't really matter, because it all enters this kind of hyperstitional loop where we're all inventing things and they're becoming reality quicker and quicker and quicker. So what I'm repeatedly interested in is kind of like the tightness of that cycle and how hard it is to make an intervention into that cycle where something could really be a provocation or a criticism that couldn't be recuperated into value once again right away.
I found this to be really, I don't know, every once in a while, when you get that gift of a moment in a book where you're like, oh, I have never literally thought about that. And so to branch off on what you're saying, you write in your essay, A Book Explodes, that a book is supposed to be a kind of magic circle that includes only the writer and the reader, which we just sort of addressed. And yet you suggest that there's an assumption that perhaps limits the life cycle or the reach of a book. Quote, like other art forms, books could be explosions with fragments and shrapnel and detritus, but the explosion has been tamped down by the commercial production of discrete objects. But interestingly, in your experiment to open your book, your previous novel, your book's concept to others, and give the novel a life outside myself, an unruly form, the central plot and characters come to the same end. Earlier, you write that writing is reproductive, and we sort of assume then with reproduction that there's a life cycle. Can you just tell us a little bit more about expanding and breaking that supposed boundary of a life cycle of a book and what's gained by doing so?
Yeah, that was super well put. Thank you for summarizing it so well and explaining me to myself. I think, so to explain basically what happened was that I took a novel that was finished but not published, and I made a live action role play out of it with the help of a friend, Susan Plotz, who's a game designer. And what that means is that it could mean lots of things, but I'll simplify. I gave a bunch of people different characters in the book. I sort of set up a general scenario to match the setting and the landscape of the book. And I had them act out the plot according to certain prompts, but essentially according to their own desires and improvisation. So a live action role play is kind of like theater without an audience. It's about what happens in this magic circle. So the term magic circle comes from gameplay, but then I sort of transpose it onto the idea of a book as kind of a covenant space between a reader and a writer, just like the covenant space between a bunch of LARPers, live action role players who are improvising and creating a co-authored communal narrative. So what I loved about that experience was that I got to give up authorship. I got to let a bunch of people take this material, kind of raw material in different directions. It didn't end up being useful for my writing process very much, but it didn't need to be. What was very interesting and kind of affirming was that the story and the game ended the same way that my book ended. So even though they got there in a different way, there was an interesting synchronicity there. And that was kind of a weird, eerie experience for me. But the idea of exploding a book that essay takes up is really, it's sort of a call for no longer seeing books as discrete entities that are, we are all part of the commercial publishing industry, for better or for worse. We do what we can, but books can expand so far beyond the object and so far beyond that singular one-way experience where somebody is receiving material that somebody else has written. And there are tons of historical examples for this. You can look at fan fiction, that's one of my favorite. You can look at all sorts of epistolary work or collaboratively written stuff. But I took up this idea of role play in particular because I like how multiple it is. I like how many people can be involved.
That's one of the really fun things about reading this entire collection is that you don't really know where you're going with these essays. And all of a sudden you turn the page and you're like, oh, we're going to be talking about LARPing. How is this going to connect? And yet you very successfully do that. And I think in one of the essays, when you talk about virtual reality, which is, again, humans sort of experiencing something that is not real, depending on how you look at that, obviously. And exactly, like, and whether live action role playing is real or is not real. I mean, it's a very, and that boundary between the two realities is one that I really hope readers are really excited to explore in the book. But I want to look at that essay on virtual reality and talk about, it sort of ties in with the writing of your own novel. You explore empathy and what motivates humans to be empathetic to a level where they change their behavior and become altruistic, philanthropic, effective in making change. Does experiencing the pain of others via virtual reality allow that pain to effectively cross boundaries between people? Does taking a pill in the fictional world that you created in your book make individuals more apt to be generous? And can that result in the spreading of wealth or opportunity? And so I'm curious about what conclusions have you drawn about empathy and the capacity of people to act in the service of others or to chip away at a system that's greater than any one of us through these alternative experiences of other realities?
Yeah, empathy comes up in various ways through the book, and most explicitly in this virtual reality essay, which looks at quite specifically like humanitarian experiments in VR, where people are placed, like a user might put on a headset and suddenly be in a war zone and experience this kind of secondhand trauma of a bomb going off. And the goal of these experiences is to create the explicit goal that the companies and the NGOs have. They always use the word empathy. They always say, we want to create empathy in the user so that the user will do X, Y, and Z. Usually they don't say it outright, but it is often couched in terms of donations. So a lot of the time it'll be tied to like a funding drive of some kind. And a lot of research has gone into this, this idea that if you kind of poke people into the proper amount of empathy, that they will, divulge, or sort of donate the right amount of money in proportion to how bad they feel. And I find this to be a kind of disturbingly functional view of the way that the human capacity for compassion and empathy work. But, the worse you feel, the more, and that it's really like it's kind of a guilt-driven device also. It's kind of confusing empathy for guilt and shame. And it also, it's so functional because it suggests that there are there's one thing you can do with your feeling of empathy, and it's to act, and it's to act in a specific way, which is usually financial. So I take issue with that, and I take issue with this idea that that empathy is for something. I think that there's like, it's kind of just like unfortunate to think that empathy would be instrumentalized and that that's why we want it. And once you're looking for it, you can see this kind of empathy discourse everywhere. It's in the newspaper every single day. It'll be like, if we can just show more pictures of Ukraine, people will finally understand, people will finally empathize more, people will finally do X, Y, and Z. It's often not really clear what people are expected to do, but the expectation is that if they feel bad enough, or if they feel on behalf of another enough, that something will change. And I'm certainly not dogging, empathy in general. And I'm certainly not saying that people don't have an incredible capacity to make connections between their own mental states and other people's mental or emotional states. And I think that that's so sacrosanct and so sacred that to functionalize it in this way it's sort of like, it cheapens it actually. And I guess all of these studies that have been done about empathy is quite interesting because a lot of these experiments kind of backfire, like a lot of this VR stuff, trying to get somebody to feel really bad and donate to a cause. Sometimes it can just make them feel alienated. Sometimes it can make them feel traumatized. Sometimes it can make them feel angry. And a lot of the time, overwhelmingly, it makes them feel helpless, rather than the sense of empowerment that it's supposed to instill. So my fascination is just like, why are we so obsessed with individualizing these issues, and why does it have to be based on a certain type of negative emotion? Like, we rarely talk about empathy in terms of like, that person is experiencing great joy. Could we experience that with them? So I guess, yeah, these are the many things I'm talking about. I'll stop for now.
Yeah, I think that I won't remember the line exactly, but you write about this question of exposure. We end up needing to see more to believe more. I think it's something like that. And I think we all have experienced that to some degree, online, in social media, all of that kind of stuff, is that we end up with so much exposure to things that we get sort of, it actually deadens our empathy rather than heightens it. Yeah. But you also talk a lot throughout a number of essays about trauma and our body's reaction to trauma. And I think one of the things that's most interesting about these virtual experiences with trauma, or even if you were to say experiencing it during a live action role play or even watching a movie, it's one of those things that we don't think about a lot, is that the experienced trauma of the viewer is then an actual physical experience of that person. And that's a really fascinating I suppose second dimension to what we usually assume is going to happen in terms of like the effect of these intentions. So the second part I was going to say about that is, during reading your book, I thought many, many times that the cliche, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And it does seem like there are a lot of instances that you bring in where people have good intentions for whatever it is that they're doing, even to the degree of an artist creating a piece of work or a writer writing a book, a LARPer creating a game, this sort of intentional use of virtual reality, that we design something to have a certain effect, but it actually ends up having a very different effect. Some people call this seeing around corners. Some people call it, just having a predictive ability. But how do we continue to create when, once we create the object that has been created, we really have no control about the effects, right? Like, we don't want to undermine creativity, but we want to question it. And how do we put that out into the world in a functional way that doesn't actually end up doing damage in the end?
Well, I think we just do it anyway.
Yeah.
I think we do it anyway, and we mitigate as much as we can the risks. I think that's what I do. It's not a how-to manual. But I think it is back to that kind of eerie causality, right? Like the world does not work in directional proportional cause and effect like we so badly want it to, given the way that it has been computationally modeled. And there's so much burden on prediction, and there's so much burden on the ability to control what happens. And I find great hope in the weirdness and the eeriness of the way that life actually works. It is just as likely to have an incredibly bizarre and wonderful outcome as it is to have an incredibly bizarre and horrible outcome.
That reminds me of, you write that dystopia and utopia are both happening at the same time, except with different size and scale, I think I'm going to get close to the paraphrase there. Can you talk about a little bit about that? About, I think a lot of people feel like we're currently living in a sort of dystopian reality. I do think that as we've been talking about categorization, we have a tendency to move those boundaries, and every year we decide this year is worse than the one before, even though really it's all about, again, the shifting of those definitions. But so what do you mean by utopia and dystopia are happening at the same time?
Well, I think that thing about every year is worse than the year before is it totally dependent on who you are. Like we could say probably Jeff Bezos had a pretty good year this year, better than last year even.
I think that's pretty secure. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for him, but it depends on all sorts of specific questions about where you are, who you are, and when you are. So this is another thing that I often tell myself to give myself a hope, which is that micro utopias are the only utopias worth having. A mega utopia is only ever going to be a control society, because one person's idea of utopia can't be everybody's. So whether or not the world is a dystopia, and I think from a planetary perspective, it definitely is when we take other species into account. Although I'm not going to, again, I shouldn't speak for them. But there are all sorts of momentary utopian things happening. Maybe they happen for a few weeks and die down. I would say, like, I've been part of political movements that have had bursts of utopian, like sparks. And they ended, but they were still pretty utopian for a while. I think it's also, just when thinking about the end of a certain time or the end of a way of being in the world or the apocalypse for humanity, we might also take comfort in the fact that utopia for other species might occur in our absence. So they could also really profit off of us having a different way of life.
In your opening essay, Death by Landscape, you challenge our perceptions of boundaries between humans and the natural world, as you just ended that previous answer. And maybe we'll call that boundary a perceived or established hierarchy, maybe an assumed hierarchy with humans in the foreground, plants, and the natural world in the background. But you also suggest humans also have two selves, the body and then the body that has an impact on the world. And this reminded me, because you were just talking about micro utopia, but you write, quote, micro and macro, first body and second body, connect in a tangible, unavoidable way. It is both impossible and necessary to tell both stories at once. Much later, when you write about the COVID pandemic, you reference a report you heard that said that large-scale reduced amounts of travel and production during the depth of the pandemic didn't actually have a lot of impact on the dire trajectory of the climate crisis. So I'm curious, again, you're not being prescriptive in these essays, but you're exploring these topics that I think we all are engaging in, how people are to think about their everyday contributions to saving the planet, their good intentions. If like recycling your water bottles and driving a hybrid car is a literal drop in a very, very deep bucket. And how do we how have you thought over how we as individuals make peace with being both responsible for damage done to the earth, but also ineffectual in reversing it?
Yeah, I think my answer to this has changed over the years. And at this point, I would say class conflict is the way to go over individually recycling our water bottles. I see this as the Capitalocene and not the Anthropocene. I see this as a problem of our economic and class system. And I feel pretty solid about that. I also have no qualms about trying my very best not to take as many international flights as I would like to take, and doing the things that actually are countable. But there's been a whole lot of recent, very clear math on who's actually taking the private jets, and most of us are not doing that. But it's a complicated interplay between making sure that we individually take responsibility for what we're doing and the fact that our bodies are implicated in ecosystems and that we are part of them, and also not insisting on individual responsibility for what is, I think, a class problem, and divided in lots of other ways, of course. But I want to just say that that idea of the second body is borrowed from a wonderful writer named Daisy Hildyard, who wrote a book called The Second Body, which I just think is fantastic. It's very short and it's very clear, and it proposes that we have this first corporeal body, that the body that has a headache, or body that eats, the body that has sex, and that there's this second body in the era of climate change, which is the body that we understand somehow, but we don't really know how it has an impact on the ice caps melting, and it's impossible to connect those two. And so what I'm kind of piggybacking on her construction and saying, but that's the job of fiction, is to talk about how those connect, even though we almost never tangibly feel that.
One of the highlights, or one of the really gratifying results of reading your work, is that we get introduced to so many different authors and all of the people who have affected how you think about these topics. And it feels like we're obtaining an education, and I know that it has stimulated my curiosity to find the works that these people are, that you sort of reference from these people. And I'm trying to think, I'm not going to remember his name, but it's it might be it's in the first section of the book, but he's talking about poems, and is it in the composting? I can't quite remember.
I think it's Lewis Hyde.
That what is?
I think it's Lewis Hyde who's talking about
Hyde. Yep. And I think that's another area where where we talk about boundaries. And I think he references the poem as being a distinct object. But another boundary that you explore early on is how reading and love have similar boundaries, that in order to read and in order to love, the experience must pass through the membrane that encloses the self-enclosure that you talk about. The writer from the reader and the lovers from one another. But there is another type of boundary you explore, and that's that boundary between the multiple selves. And so this, I'm going to jump all the way now to the essay on LARPing, because this, again, as I said, this reads like the veins in a piece of marble, like you can just sort of follow them in so many different areas. But you talk about bleed. So the first part that I referenced is this sort of voluntary crossing of boundaries. And then when you're talking about being involved in a role-playing game that includes consent, but also when you've practiced or performed or played within that reality, that can bleed into the other reality, your other experiences. And you write, to know that you are both a player and character is to know that others are too, to negotiate between these selves, allowing the actual and possible to coexist while not merging into a single focus is an act of bravery, if not an act of love. Acknowledging bleed is acknowledging the possibility of taking on infinite selves without fearing loss of self among them. And I think so moving all through your book, where we start with, I guess with poetry, with love, with practicing different realities, or I don't know why I want to use the word practicing, but it feels like it's not performative. It's actually exercising yourself within that self, but then also how that then you take that with you, whether it's the poem you read or the love you loved, or the 6 hours you spent in role playing. And that blurring of those lines is very exciting, but it can also be really frightening for people. So when we talk about breaking down boundaries, when we talk about setting different kinds of limitations, deconstructing assumptions, how do you feel that people can sort of deal with the uncertainty and fear that comes from all that weirdness?
I think bleed is a really useful concept that comes from LARPing. It's, as you said, this idea that what happens in the game will bleed into your real life, and likewise your real self will bleed into the game. And that while there is this magic circle where everything is supposed to be contained within it, it would be ridiculous to assume that the boundary is firm and that the person that you are doesn't affect the player or the character who you're playing, and that what you learn from the game wouldn't then change your life. And it's the same with all of these bounded experiences, as you say, like reading or like being in love. I think I quote Anne Carson much and very lovingly. She says, "Desire changes the lover." Love is one of the greatest incursions that will happen in your life, or something like that. And she talks about love as this incursion, this kind of piercing, this challenge, something that changes the story or the narrative of yourself. And a book will do the same if you let it, I think. And there is kind of an interesting history that Anne Carson traces between the history of the written word and the history of the idea of love figured as kind of a boundary threat, and sort of like the evolution of like the novel as a genre. Kind of, it was originally kind of about love often. Anyway, I call this book fan nonfiction because I'm such a fan of everyone who I quote in it. And as you say, it's just an incredibly long reading list at the end.
I feel like even in my questions and in my preparation for talking with you, like I felt an enormous responsibility to try to reflect the wide range and then the depth with which you investigate so many of these topics. And I am afraid that I've probably been really long-winded in trying to prop up these answers, but I'm really hoping that people get a sense of the just impressiveness with which these topics are brought to our awareness. But I think you said this a few minutes ago, but I just want to stress that even though the name of the book is Death by Landscape, and you do talk a lot about the climate crisis, and we do talk a lot about systemic oppression and repression and all of the ways that we create boundaries around the other and don't allow us to experience the weird or experience much with a lot of freedom, that there is a lot of hope and a lot of optimism in the message in these essays, that together we can make an impact, whether it's on climate change, on systems of oppression, on hegemonic boundaries between us. There's always something that is changing, and that may actually be the boundaries with which we sort of bind ourselves up with. And you talk about fiction a little bit, and I want to bring it back to the artist, I suppose, is that with fiction, you write, fiction works as in performs a type of labor in service of change for better or worse. And art, fiction, technology, all the topics you investigate in these essays have power to influence the future, but cannot be controlled by the creator. So people need to engage with all of it in order to actually reap the benefits, I suppose, or to actually bring functional change. And so I think that that is ultimately what we're left with after reading the book is a sense of hope and a sense of distinguishing our tendency to be binary and instead see things with more nuance. So my final question for you is, if there is one thing that you would like people to take away from both this talk and as they read your book, what is it that you feel most moved to do the work that you do?
Well, I will just say, I think you've done an absolutely wonderful job of bringing out all of these strands and making sense of them in a short amount of time. So thank you. I think the sentence I think of most often that I quote in this book, it's a quote from the philosopher Emanuele Coccia, and he wrote a book about plants. And he writes in it that plants are domestic titans who do not need violence to form new worlds. And that is my hope for the future, that we can act more like plants, making new worlds around us without having to reach too far beyond where we actually live and without violence.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for spending this hour with us. Thank you, all of our attendees, for tuning in. And I really hope that, like myself, you will be hunting down everything that you write in the future, because it is an investment in how we want the future to change. And it's just an incredibly impressive work. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thanks to everyone for coming. We wouldn't have bookstores, 2 of them, without you. Hope to see you in another event.